At the moment, these tariff agreements are like Swiss cheese.
I would say it'll be somewhere in the 15 to 20% range.
We started the beginning of the year at a 3% average effective tariff rate.
Costs, usually that would mean that they have to leave some people.
This will not turn out to be inflation because we'll make sure that it's...
Those tailwinds have a long time, I suppose, a long runway to play.
Strange how one decision on oil can reshape the world economy. Right now, Washington is pushing allies to slap tariffs as high as 100% on China and India because of their purchases of Russian crude. Beijing calls it bullying. India says it's unjustified. Europe is hesitating, and the global balance could change. Washington's tariff offensive. In mid-September 2025, President Donald Trump called on America's allies in the Group of Seven and NATO to impose sweeping tariffs on Chinese and Indian imports. The reasoning from Washington is simple but severe. By buying oil from Russia, both Beijing and New Delhi are helping fund Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine. The push isn't just a passing suggestion. A position paper shared with G7 finance ministers spelled it out clearly. The G7 should immediately impose 50 to 100% secondary tariffs on China and India for their purchases of Russian crude oil. This was reported by the Financial Times, which confirmed that the memo was circulated just before a video call of finance chiefs. Trump also told European Union leaders that their sanctions against Russia are meaningless unless they target the main buyers of Russian oil. He claimed that if NATO and the EU stopped buying Russian energy themselves, and if China and India were hit with heavy tariffs, Moscow would be forced into peace talks. The US Treasury Department reinforced that message. A spokesperson said Chinese and Indian oil deals were funding Putin's war machine and prolonging the senseless killing of the Ukrainian people. They added that the tariffs would not be permanent. According to Washington, they would be lifted the very day the war ends. China's furious response. China has not taken kindly to being singled out. At a press conference in Madrid on September 15th, Li Chenggang, China's international trade representative and vice minister of commerce, warned that no external pressure would force Beijing to compromise its sovereignty or development. He stated bluntly that if China's legitimate rights are harmed, the country will resolutely take countermeasures. Standing beside him was Wang Jingtao of the Cyberspace Administration of China, while Ministry of Commerce spokesperson He Yadong chaired the session. The Chinese message was united and firm. Tariffs and threats will not succeed. The same day in Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian repeated the warning. He stressed that China's trade with Russia complies with WTO rules and market principles, and that it does not target any third country. Lin criticized the U.S. approach as unilateralism, bullying, and economic coercion. He argued that such threats only disrupt global supply chains, making the situation worse rather than bringing peace closer. China also used the moment to reaffirm its stance on Ukraine. Lin said, "Dialogue and negotiation is the only way out of the crisis." Beijing has long positioned itself as neutral, resisting calls to condemn Moscow outright, but also denying that it actively supports the war. India under pressure. India is also caught in Washington's crosshairs. According to Reuters and the Financial Times, India imported about 88 million tons of Russian oil last year, meeting 35% of its total energy demand. Much of that oil is refined and resold to other countries, including some in Europe. In August 2025, the Trump administration imposed a punitive 25% tariff on Indian goods because of its Russian oil purchases. That came on top of an earlier 25% duty introduced after bilateral trade talks collapsed. The result, a combined 50% tariff on many Indian exports to the US. Indian officials have called these tariffs unjustified, noting that the US and EU still import some Russian energy themselves. But the financial impact is already visible. The Global Trade Research Initiative estimates that Indian exports to the US will fall by around $5.76 billion this year, a 6.4% decline compared with 2024. Industries like fishing, iron and steel, jewelry, vehicles, and electronics are bracing for heavy losses. For New Delhi, the tariffs don't just mean lost revenue. They also threaten millions of jobs tied to exports. As a result, India is looking for alternatives. Trade talks with Europe, Southeast Asia, and Africa are accelerating. And in late August, just weeks after the new tariff regime was finalized, India and China pledged to be partners, not rivals. Europe's dilemma. While Washington is pressing hard, Europe is far from convinced. EU officials who joined the G7 video call admitted they were reluctant to impose secondary sanctions on China and India. They acknowledged the need to keep pressure on Moscow, but they also warned that tariffs on two of their largest trade partners could spark a damaging trade war. The EU is also negotiating a major trade deal with India, which leaders see as essential for expanding European ties in Asia. Slapping tariffs now could derail those talks. At the same time, Brussels has been trying to stabilize its complex relationship with Beijing. For European capitals, being forced to choose between Washington and their Asian partners is a risk with enormous economic consequences. The UK, under Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer, is preparing for Trump's state visit next week. His government hopes to steer the US toward more targeted sanctions. Jonathan Powell, Starmer's national security advisor, said Britain would prefer penalties on specific Chinese and Indian companies involved in Russian oil deals rather than blanket tariffs that could start a trade war. Still, London has taken its own measures. On September 12th, it announced sanctions on 100 Russian oil tankers, companies, and individuals. Turkey and NATO energy purchases. Adding to the complexity, some NATO members continue buying Russian oil themselves. Turkey, for example, is the third largest importer of Russian oil after China and India. Several EU countries also rely on Russian natural gas, even as they back Ukraine and sanction Moscow in other ways. Trump argues that this inconsistency undermines Western efforts. He insists that if NATO and EU members stop their own purchases and join the US in penalizing China and India, Moscow will have no choice but to negotiate a fragile tariff truce with Beijing. The timing of Washington's tariff push is striking. Back in May 2025, China and the US reached a fragile truce that prevented tariff rates on each other's goods from hitting triple digits. That truce was extended in August, offering temporary relief. But the current dispute over Russian oil threatens to unravel it completely. Talks between the two sides in Madrid are supposed to focus on tariffs, technology export controls, and the controversial demand that ByteDance divest from TikTok in the US. Yet the new tariff threats hang over every discussion. Li Chenggang told reporters the talks were going smoothly, but with China warning of retaliation, the atmosphere is tense. To complicate matters further, China's market regulator announced last week that a preliminary investigation had found US chipmaker Nvidia in violation of the country's anti-monopoly law. That move is widely seen as a countermeasure to US restrictions on tech exports. Seizing Russian assets. Tariffs are not the only tool on Washington's table. According to the G7 memo, the Trump administration also wants countries to seize hundreds of billions of dollars in frozen Russian state assets. Most of those assets are currently held in Belgium. The EU has already agreed to use profits from the assets to support Ukraine, but many European capitals, including Berlin and Brussels, remain cautious about seizing the principal. They fear market instability and possible legal challenges. Other measures being pushed by the US include sanctions on Rosneft, Russia's largest oil company, tighter bans on Russian shipping, and restrictions on the Mir payment system, which has replaced SWIFT for most Russian banks since 2022. Europe's energy transition. Meanwhile, the EU is debating whether to bring forward its 2027 deadline for ending purchases of Russian oil and gas. According to 3 European officials, Brussels is considering new deadlines, but faces resistance from Hungary and Slovakia, which continue buying Russian oil via pipeline and have blocked tougher sanctions in the past. EU Energy Commissioner Dan Jurgensen met with US Energy Secretary Chris Wright on September 11th to discuss replacing Russian LNG with American supplies. Jurgensen said, "We need, as fast as possible, to make sure that we get rid of the dependency that we still have on Russian energy." Even so, the EU still sources about 20% of its gas from Russia, down from 45% before the invasion of Ukraine, toward a multipolar trade order. If current trends continue, the global economy could look very different by the end of this decade. For many countries, the US is starting to look like a partner whose policies can change suddenly, leaving them vulnerable. By contrast, long-term agreements with Beijing or diversified ties across Asia and Africa seem more stable. What happens next depends on whether Washington can persuade Europe to join its campaign. For now, China is standing firm, India is diversifying, and Europe is hesitating. The fragile tariff truce between Beijing and Washington could break at any moment. And with each new tariff, more countries may decide they'd rather hedge against the US than align with it. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Do you think Washington's tariff strategy will succeed?